you kind of know what swirls around in our heads when we have to create these options for you. There's a lot of detail that goes into pretty global thinking. We have to understand really the condition of the existing buildings at a pretty granular detail in order to be responsible to you in delivering a project that's feasible. And we also have to know in pretty granular detail what it is that we're actually designing, this new library and meeting space. And we're dealing with an 8,000 square foot library now and a 20,000 square foot community center. And the hypothesis that we began the study with, you always have to begin with a hypothesis. The hypothesis we began with was, well, wait a minute. The community center is 2 or 3 times bigger than it needs to be, and the library is a half to a third of the size that it needs to be. Why don't we just swap the two? So that is something we ran with, and we're going to present to you the findings of that hypothesis. But as with any good thinking process, you also have to have a control to that process. You have to think outside of the box, so to speak, and wonder if there isn't a simpler way to do it. And after some thinking, we think there are 2 equally viable options. The one where we swap out the 2 uses, and the other where we actually just do a nice 20,000 square foot library and renovate the existing library to become the community center that's right-sized, a lean, mean meeting machine that actually deals with the actual needs that the neighborhood community center is addressing now. So I'm going to describe to you the 2 recommendations that we're making for your consideration until we meet again in June. Beginning with the first, I should say we should begin first with just understanding, there's an errant label, that we should understand the existing site for a second. So just to make sure everyone's oriented, because it's actually been confusing to me. South is to your left and north is to your right. So the east side of the site runs along the bottom. The east side of the site is Park Avenue. The west side of the site is Anaheim, and the south side is 18th Street, just so we're understanding solar orientation. The 3 main buildings that occupy the heart of the site being the 2 buildings we've been talking about, as well as the downtown recreation center. Parking resides in 2 kinds of locations. There's about close to 300 spaces, of which about a third or slightly less than 100 occur along the 3 streets at the perimeter of the park, and then about 2/3 on the surface lots that occupy sites adjacent to the library and the community center and fronting onto Park Avenue. The 3 main entrances are the 2 off of Park, north and south, and the 1 off of Anaheim. It's important to understand actually how service, emergency, and fire access takes place on the site. Essentially cuts through the parking lots. And the building, which has created some problems, which we'll talk about in a second, the community center actually turns its back to the corner of 18th and Park Avenue, and there's a service dock and solid walls along that frontage that faces out onto the area of the park that occupies that corner. I'm talking about this area here. You can essentially see this building has basically turned its back to the park. And you're now living with the consequences of that decision that was made a while ago. In terms of landscape and open space, so there are 3 general categories. There's recreational fields, there's gardens, and kind of miscellaneous landscape. And then there's what's most important from our point of view, which is, and I think from your point of view, is park open space. That's essentially what ends up being consumed over time. Everyone has all sorts of ideas about how to put stuff in the park, and pretty soon it doesn't feel like a park anymore because there's no open space. It's very hard for people to keep their hands off of it. But if you think about Central Park, what makes it so successful is there's, relative to the city around it, there's nothing in it. And so this is really ought to be a goal. If we invest any dollars in this, into these buildings, we ought to think about the park as a whole. Think about the project as enhancing, if not renovating, Lions Park. And of course, we're also wanting to live with a future thinking ethic, one of sustainability, and one of the most important things is deal with water. And the way we deal with water in terms of land planning is the difference between permeable and impermeable ground planes. So we want to minimize the amount, we're so happy to do here in LA and Orange counties is just to pave over tons of acreage to accommodate our big 3,000-pound metal boxes. And what that does is that ends up taking all the water that falls from the skies and into the drain system and out to the ocean. So we need to contribute to sustainable living by how we plan these sites. And you're doing a good job at it. The city's about to complete, I'm sure you know, a beautiful new garden, which is actually, in fact, an infiltration basement that will handle stormwater. And that sits right behind the library, as you can see in the aerial view here. So let's begin with the first hypothesis, which is to swap out the uses of the two buildings, which would require some minor additions to this building and some minor additions to the other building, but not really anything of great significance. It would include some enhancements to the park. For example, we would recommend we get rid of that parking lot in front of the community center because it's really not a very gracious way to present library to the street with a big parking lot in front of it. And we would probably include a promenade that would connect the three buildings across in the two sides of the park between Park Avenue and Anaheim Avenue. Taking a closer look on how we would actually transform this building into a library, it actually works out pretty well. Assuming the feasibility is there in terms of renovating the existing facility and the dollars are there, it actually can be a quite nice library facility. So where the entrance is now would remain more or less the entrance. We put the various components that typically congregate around the entrance, which are teens, children's, and the friends, as well as the popular library. Teens and children, because you don't want them traipsing through all of the adult sections while adults are reading in quiet, supposedly quiet areas. So you generally want to congregate the teens and the children near the front entrance and on the ground floor, obviously, of the facility. This room, essentially, and that actually quite beautiful corridor, which is oversized for the need of the building, but which could be transformed into kind of beautiful reading space, if you think about it. Both of these rooms, the corridor and the big room here, are really, you can imagine actually collections and seating areas in those two rooms were done properly, be quite nice. And then importantly, two community meeting rooms, which are roughly the same size as what we're calling the Victoria and the Hamilton, that half of the room divided into two, but in this case better situated relative to what will become perhaps the new community center in the existing library building. Meaning they are an ensemble. It's just that the meeting space is distributed differently within the building. So once we did that, we could then vacate the existing library, and it's pretty easy transformation to a fairly nice meeting space. So site work around it would include that promenade that connects the two sides of the park one to the other. We'd actually be able to, in this case, introduce an outdoor event space that's very easily accessed from the main room. So you can imagine reception, pre-function and post-function occurring in that space before you and after you enter the room for whatever takes place in there. And then you would build a new stage and back of house facilities on the, is that the west side, the east side, the north side of the building. With the new main hall occupying the central space. So you can get about 300 seats in the lecture and meeting style, and you can get about 300 seats in banquet style. And you can imagine the space actually pretty easily converting into a fairly nice, certainly much nicer than this room, I'll go out on a limb and say, and a quite beautiful actually enhancement to both the building and to the inventory of spaces that the city is able to make available to the community. So just so you can compare, this is in red is the size of this room that we're in, laid on top of the size of the room that would take place in the new community center building. So you can compare them side by side here. So in this scenario, this is how the meeting spaces would array on the site. And again, you can think of it really as the two buildings are an ensemble of meeting spaces. That added up to roughly 8,000 square feet compared to the roughly 9,600 square feet that occur on the site now. Again, they're just distributed differently on the site. And here is how they situate essentially in the center of the park. So comparing the existing park to a hypothesis renovated park, we're actually increasing through the execution of this project, we're actually increasing the amount of park open space. And it's important, it's along the street. Remember, one of the functions of a city park is just visual relief. You may not even have to actually occupy it. When you drive or walk by it or ride your bike by it, it just provides relief from the rest of the city around you. So we're increasing from less than 3 acres to a little bit more than 3.5 acres. It's actually a pretty good increase, 25% or so. We're reducing the parking a little bit. We replaced the parking that we took out with adding a little bit more along Park Avenue here. I'm sure if we got deeper into the project, we could recover that parking back. And if one were to do this project, you would probably engage in a parking and traffic study to understand what the real need is. But we're confident that it's of equal value, the parking is before and after the renovation. And here's a view of the project at completion. You see the promenade that connects north and south, east and west. I'm now officially confused. The new park open space that fronts onto Park Avenue. So that was great. It's pretty good. Might work out. Probably feasible. But we thought it might be wise on your behalf to take a step back and see if there's actually perhaps a simpler approach. Because I do want to point out actually that to do this, let's say we did turn this building into the library first, then you'd actually have to move the community center out for a year and a half. And all of its users would then distribute to all that fabulous space around the city. And then you would move the library in. And then once the library's in, you move the old library out, and then you renovate that building. So it's a two-step, it's actually a three-step process to do that. And you may end up with compromised results for the reason that I perhaps established before, which is that once you get into these buildings, you're going to face a series of compromises, no matter what you do. So we wondered if there was a simpler approach, which was to just build a new library. So we looked at a few options. We looked at just doing a 2-story library, 20,000 square feet, so half the footprint between the two buildings. And the interesting thing about that is that you could just build the new library. These two buildings just keep operating as they are. And then once you build the new library and you move the community center into the old library, then you can take down this building altogether, and it has a huge footprint, and you can devote that footprint to more park space. Another option is just to do it in the parking lot in front. Long, thin building that faces onto Park Avenue. That'd actually be really nice. The front door, the front facade is just facing right there on the street, a very prominent, beautiful position on the street. Or you could do it on the west side of the community center. And this was an intriguing south side, excuse me. Southwest, I bet it actually is. And so we looked at all three of those options. We met with various departments in the city, including police and fire, as well as the building department, and with city staff and a variety of leaders and whatnot. And what emerged as the clear favorite was the third option, which was to build the new library. Were we to go down this path on the on the 18th Street side of the neighborhood community center. And this was intriguing to a lot of people for a lot of reasons, not the least of which, for example, we know that there's some activity that goes on in the area of the park at the corner of 18th and Park Avenue that is unwanted. And nothing disperses unwanted activity more than just building a building on it or next to it, with its construction, trucks and fencing and dust and noise and whatnot. And the city is engaged in this new project. I think the police substation right across on 18th Street. And so it's kind of intriguing that just with this one very simple move, doing this nice little library in the park adjacent to this area that has been subject to so much problems over the years, you would actually then basically make that problem go away in a fairly simple way through sound planning of your community facilities. So the library itself is what actually activates the park in either side of it. When there are people around, things that are unwanted don't necessarily take place, and particularly in this case when you'd have both sides of it being surveyed. The park open space is expanded even more dramatically in this situation, almost up to 4 acres, mainly because of the removal of the neighborhood community center. Parking is roughly equivalent, only slightly less. So we and many people within many departments of the city believe this is a viable alternative. So it's going to be one of the decisions that we have to make is this going to be also the best library for you? So we have to drill down into that detail with Linda's program to understand how it works as a library. So on this, remember that floor plate now is half the size. So we've got basically the same size building cut into 2 and laid one over the other. So beginning on the 2nd floor, we would have all of the adult areas, essentially administration and technology and collections and reading, with the staff basically at the heart of the building, and all of the public areas, including teens, at the perimeter of the building. And at the ground floor next to the entrance, one of which would face Park Avenue, the other, the park, would be those functions I described, particularly children's and popular, which you want to have on the ground floor near the entrance. And then the 2 community rooms would be facing towards the new community center. So here again, we have an array of community meeting rooms that's essentially the same as what you have. It's just distributed differently within the park. So roughly 8,000 square feet of new meeting space relative to the 9,600 square feet you have now. So with this option, essentially you're faced with now 2 different paths to take, and this is something that everyone in the community should really now spend the next month and a half or so really deciding which path they'd like to take. We are beginning to understand the cost implications of each of the 2 paths, and our understanding that they're actually not that far apart in terms of how much they cost. We're not ready to actually yet to share that with you because we don't have all of our information yet, and we will be happy to share that with you next time we meet. So with that, finally, I will open it up to questions. We're happy to stay as long as you like to answer any questions that you may have. I would ask that, let's see, I guess I'll have to be the director. If you have a question, we're going to ask you to come to the front of the room to the microphone and ask your question so that everyone in the room can hear it. So the question was, can you hear me? Option number, well, there were 2 options presented. One was switching the use of the building, so this becomes the library, Dungan becomes the community center. The other option was to build a new library and take down this building. In both options, Dungan becomes the new community center. And the question was, did I offer an opinion on which was more feasible or desirable? And I did not. So feasibility is a kind of loaded question. Anything is feasible if you have the money. And even if you have the money, do you have the wisdom to do what's right? So it's really a question of what delivers the best value for your dollar. So if you had the money, you could invest in this building and in the other building, but would it actually result in the best value? The best bang for your buck is another way of saying it. I'm not suggesting an opinion on that right now. I'm just suggesting that we need to look, we do know enough to know that we need to look at both options. Is it a simpler and better option to deliver a new library, take this building down, and move the community center in a more efficient way in the existing library building?
I always found that this building is cold. It's got all this concrete and it's cold. It does have some brick, but it isn't cute, you know? It seemed even less utilized than you indicated. We're surprised it's used that much. That's all.
Option 2, what's the distance from the parking to the entrance of the library? It looks quite far for some of our senior citizens or people with disabilities.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of parking. This parking doesn't exist right now. This is
Well, that's parking, not the street.
Yes, exactly.
I was in awe of your presentation. The vision you have for a library is absolutely beautiful. I came tonight with the intention to oppose the redevelopment of two different buildings, trying to squeeze one into the other when this was indeed built for community meetings, and it has indeed served a very good function. So even though it's not busy every day, there are many times when people come here. It is the place where people know to come, and it serves a very valuable function, so that needs to continue. One thing I was going to say, it does not have quite ample parking. There are many times when the lots are completely full and people are running from across the street. The idea of adding a building, so that would take away my objection, and of course you made it worse with your devils in the details, and a concrete stage and all the other expensive and difficult problems with renovations. So when you say add a different building, I say your library looks wonderful, go for it. But then I have another question. Why indeed take this building down when open space could be created in some other way? So you could build a new one, still have this, have all the teen, that was wonderful, all the teen and youth groups that you want, and perhaps the Dungan Library, if it's outlived its usefulness, could become green space in the garden there.
Thank you. The second option would allow you actually to keep this building in place. That would just be a decision the community would make. Do they want more park space or continue using the existing building?
Well, can you hear me? There we go. I like option 2. I like more green space, and I love the Dungan Library the way it is. But from this point, where do we go to get the go-ahead to say, yes, we're building? What is that process and timeline?
Okay. So as I described at the top of the presentation, we're about halfway through this process. And we put forth two possibilities for the community to consider and its leadership to consider, both of which now have to be considered in light of feasibility, which means dollars have to now come into the equation, and then that has to be related to the resources that are available in terms of dollars to the community. So all of that kind of decision making is going to take place now over the next few months. We're still in the process of formulating those options, and they will be presented back to you in more detail at the third meeting, and then from there they go to the commissions, and from the commission's recommendations go to council, and council can decide whatever it thinks is most prudent for the community. I don't know what that decision is. It could be to choose one or the other of those options, or to choose neither of those options. That's really, they're here to listen to you over the next few months, and at that point they will make that decision. One of which could be this community needs a new branch library, size of 20,000 square feet, and we're going to do a new one in Lions Park. That could be their decision. I don't know what it could be. No, we think it's more prudent to renovate this building to become the library and renovate that building to become the community center. Or it could be a third option or no option at all.
Well, for many of us, having a brand new library would be a dream come true, something that we've been thinking about and praying about for a long time, but the devil's in the details. Having been to the Tussin Library and several times, familiar with that, with some of the library board members, maybe you could talk a little bit about how much that cost and the way it was financed. Because it's my understanding it wasn't just the city, it was charities and the state. There was a combination of funding. And do you see, you said you couldn't talk about the price, the cost, but do you see the gulf between the two being wide, or
No.
they're going to be pretty close?
They're pretty close. They're within 10%, 15% of each other.
And that includes all the upgrades and
Yes.
to the codes and
Yes.
and everything. So, but okay. So
They're closer than one might imagine. One might automatically imagine that renovating a building is cheaper than building
yeah,
a new
you would.
building.
That's what we kind of thought that.
Except that if you think about it, this building has to be taken apart, really, essentially, and then rebuilt. That's really the way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I appreciate the way you've done the presentation. I don't know if you know the cost that it was to build the Tustin Library, but it's not that old, and it's about the same footprint that we'd be talking about. No, it's not. Is it bigger?
It's much larger, yeah? No?
It's 30,000 square feet.
It's 30,000.
Yeah, so it's 50% larger, but if you walk through there, like into the children's room, we held up on painting that last facade for the donor. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of donor names and
Yeah.
a lot of big spaces in there, absolutely.
That's right. Do you remember how much that was altogether? What the total cost of that was? 30? 30 grand?
No, I don't
Million.
I don't think it was 30 million. I think it was about 22. But it was bid at a time when the economy was trying to recover.
Yeah, that's true.
So
Okay.
it's recovering. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Okay, wonderful presentation. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions and some issues. The question number one is, I didn't hear any mention of kitchen space. I assume, though, that you've made some plan
Yes.
for kitchen space in the Dungan Library if it turned into a community center.
Yes, you're right. I skipped over that. It was in that orange area that's by the back of stage.
Okay. Next thing, when I see the different placements of a potential new library and I see the open space,
Yes.
I see a potential for a soccer field. Is that space actually large enough to put some kind of a playing field?
Probably, but if it were up to me, I would recommend informal play. I wouldn't fence it off and put goals and striping all of that, because then you're just turning it into a recreation field, and that's different from a park. But that's your decision to make.
It happens to be a topical issue because there are other segments of our group, of our city that feel that we don't have nearly enough field space, and they want to take down
Oh yeah, that's a
other
perennial problem.
open space and turn that into field space. This might be a more appropriate place to do that, maybe.
I'll interrupt for 1 second. There was a suggestion that that lawn could become actually more community meeting space, that you could actually hold functions on that lawn, that the library could actually function as a stage for, say, summer concerts in the park or that kind of thing, which could be compatible with an informal playing field. So anyway.
I notice also that the space between the ball field right now and the neighborhood recreation center
Yes.
is fenced off. And I
Yeah.
think this is because of the problem that
Yes.
you mentioned. And let's be honest, what we're talking about is people who sleep here, okay, people who are homeless.
Yes.
Okay, that's the supposed problem that folks want to deal with. To me, that's an awful way of dealing with it, to take that space away from public use at all. It worries me that maybe putting the library in the spot that you've shown it might make the play space a little bit less attractive to homeless folks, but it could be that the space on the other side of the building becomes more attractive. And so all I'm
Yeah.
saying is, I think that we need a holistic approach to this.
Yes.
And I certainly am not one who thinks that it should be driven only by public safety concerns. I mean, I think that it's important to listen to the police, but if the police were in charge, they'd just put a fence around the whole thing, and you'd have to show ID to even get in.
Right. I hope I succeeded in describing an approach that's not aggressive. I actually think that when you put up security fences, you actually exaggerate the problem. It's self-fulfilling, essentially. But if you have a friendly building that's transparent, that you can see through, and that connects to the landscape where people are actually living life, then those issues have a way of dissipating on their own.
I'll admit I don't understand the complexity. You did a fantastic job of explaining some very difficult things. But as an educator, I just have to say what strikes me is that we spend a lot of time telling kids to reuse, reduce, and recycle, and that to, abandon this building or take it down. I think that, yes, money is a very important issue, and the complexities of changing this building are probably worse than building a new one. But I think that we also have to be an example, and that should be taken into consideration. But there could be a good argument for doing it.
That's why sustainability is an art, it's not a science.
Yeah, thank you.
There are always competing choices to make. So you could argue that, yes, the sustainable thing to do is to reuse things that you have. You could also argue that this was built at a time when land was plentiful and we just built one-story buildings like crazy because we just had everywhere to go, and actually one-story buildings are not sustainable. We shouldn't be doing that. If everyone built a two-story building instead, we could be half the footprint. So it's always a push-pull. These sorts of philosophical discussions there's never a single right answer. It's a value system, essentially. Thank you.
One of the questions that I have is that one very serious consideration of having money enough in our library system and so forth isn't just building the building. After we build the building,
Yes.
we have to staff it and so forth. And I think, I may be wrong, that a two-story building would be harder to staff than a one-story building, and more expensive. The county had said that they would, with their first kind of drawing of what they would do with this building, said, well, they could make that work with the money that we had. I forget how much money there is in our tax system to operate our libraries in Costa Mesa, but this may make it more expensive to run the libraries. And, well, first of all, I think we should be making that money in that's available for running it higher anyway, but I wonder if the two-story building had been run through the county people to say if they would be able to staff it for the same amount of money and so forth.
We actually did have that conversation, and you're right, the 20,000 square foot library is sustainable with your dollars. Turning it into a two-story project does add, it's the movement of materials and the staff. There are a number of things, though, that are changing, and they're changing fairly quickly. One is the way we handle materials. So simply by adding this automated materials handling, you could repurpose staff for other things. The second is we're really looking to enhance self-service opportunities, self-pay, self-check, and rather than, I see this everywhere now, rather than walk in and see this bank vault of a desk with 5 people sitting at it, it's kind of like at the kiosk at the airport now. You get a lot of your business done before you get there, and you only need 1 or 2 people, and then the other people are roving around the building. So like in a goods department store, if you're standing there looking at the stack, somebody walks over to you, which would put personnel on both levels. So the service model would change. It might not be as white glove as it feels now, and we all love that. I'm holding this book for you, but there would be some changes for sure.
My question, where do you foresee the building frontage sort of addressing? Do you see it addressing that new green space, or do you see it kind of also addressing Lions Park?
That's a great question.
Flowing pedestrian traffic through, I don't know, more predominant sight lines, I guess, through that corner of coming from, what's that, Newport. I didn't know if that was maybe too far down the line, but sort of how do you see traffic, pedestrian traffic, flowing through the parking lot as well as from Park Avenue and Anaheim?
It's a good question. It actually has 3 fronts, so it's facing laterally, both the park on either side of it, but its main entry is actually facing Park Avenue. So it's a cruciform, so you can enter both from the park and from Park Avenue and arrive at in the same place.
Do you see the hierarchy being part, sort of as the main, sort of main?
They're kind of equal, actually. This entrance through the popular library and this entrance from the street are entirely equal in terms of access. So you could park in the lots over by Dungan and walk along the promenade to the front door, or you could park along Park Avenue and just walk right into the front door from Park Avenue.
Okay, thanks.
One of the things that we're looking at really carefully in all of these organizations is that you be able to operate the meeting room when the rest of the library is closed. So there would be toilet facilities associated with the meeting rooms and a door, and then whether it's a grill or a series of doors, so it would make the room more accessible than just to the limits of the library's hours.
I have a couple concerns. One is, at the beginning, we heard how expensive it would be to redo the buildings that exist now, right?
Well, we didn't hear about how expensive it was. I just laid out the issues with it.
I think it would be helpful to know new versus,
Sure.
especially for the community center, because we know about the
Yes.
library, but would it be better to tear down the old library and build a new community center rather than trying to renovate with all the expense? That's one question. The other question is, I'm worried about the parking, because you said with a new library, we could expect 2 to 3 times the number of people using it, and I don't see any increase in parking. So would you have to look at a parking structure?
Well, we would have to look at a parking study to determine what the parking need would be,
Because we're
absolutely, without a
actually
doubt.
reducing the parking.
Yeah, by a little bit.
Yeah.
Yes, you're right.
So those are my questions.
Mhm.
We just used this room for an event, and it was just fabulous. And I don't think there are a lot of meeting rooms in Costa Mesa that will accommodate more than 300 or 400 people. So
That's right.
in the library, did I hear there's going to be one for, no, it's just the new community center
It's
might have room
300.
for 300.
Right.
So you're really taking away a big meeting room space.
No, this room holds 300.
I know, but these two rooms hold 400
No,
or
these,
more.
when I say this room, I mean the entire room. Holds 300 in banquet seating.
No, but not in theater style.
In theater style, 400. In that run, it would
So
be,
that was just a concern of mine.
Yes.
If you have a big event, there's not much meeting space in Costa
but
Mesa.
I think we determined that there actually are, very rarely is there an event of 400 people that occurs in this room.
Anyway, the parking is my main,
Okay.
because it sounds great, but also the cost of redoing the old library for the new.
Yes,
Is it more expensive and is it worth it rather than,
good question, yes, thank you.
I'm not sure if I heard the previous lady. Could we keep this building and the Dungan Library and build a new library? Wouldn't we also have to go through all the renovation, all the upgrades and up to code of this building? I mean, how could we
Yes, you
possibly
would.
keep it?
I'm just
That's what
saying
you
it's
said.
possible. Whether it's
You could still do it.
desirable is another
You could
question.
still do it, though.
You
See,
can do it.
all three.
You can,
Possible.
yes.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
It seems to me that if whatever option we go for, it would be really nice to have an enclosed outdoor area
Yes.
for sitting and perhaps a place to get a cup of coffee and a bit of food.
Could you be a little more specific about what you're going to be doing between this meeting and the next meeting?
We're going to be developing the two options. So these two options, unless we hear otherwise, we're going to develop at the direction of the city these two options. So we're going to know better how the library program fits into each option. We're going to know better what the consequences of the renovation options are. We're going to have a very detailed cost estimate for each of the options. And all of that is really to be laid out for you and your leadership to make the decision on where to go from there. and a schedule estimate, both design and construction, were you to go down that path. We'll even have talk a little bit about what the buildings could look like, both in terms of style and character and quality. Because the two options do have different aesthetic consequences, so that's part of the equation. All right, can we draw the meeting to a close? All those in favor?